If you think the passage of time, even an enormous passage of time, might preclude police from solving a case, you'd be wrong. In 1974, Brisbane mother Barbara McCulkin and her 2 daughters disappeared from their home in Brisbane. Their bodies have never been found, but it was always viewed as a case where Barbara was thought to have known too much about her ex-husband's underworld connections. That case was solved a couple of years ago when 2 of her husband's associates, Vincent O'Dempsey and Gary Dubois, were given life sentences for the murders of Barbara and her children. And there are others. In 1986, 20-year-old Sharon Phillips disappeared from the side of the road when her car broke down. More than 30 years on, police revealed they had her killer, a taxi driver who had been parked behind the row of shops where she'd used a payphone to call for help that night. Raymond Peter Mulvihill, according to Queensland Police, kidnapped Sharon and murdered her. If he hadn't have died in 2002, they would have charged him. An inquest will be held later this year to test the evidence they recently collected. With the Spear Creek murders, we're looking at 4 decades. 4 decades have passed since the bodies of Karen Edwards, Timothy Thompson and Gordon Twaddle were found in the bush near Mount Isa. And despite that passage of time, homicide detectives currently reviewing the case believe they can solve it. There are still plenty of people who remember seeing the friends when they started out on their trip around Australia, a trip that was supposed to take months but ended after only 3 days. But first, I spoke to someone who will never forget what she saw. This is Kirsten, who no matter how many years pass, will still see the image of a body lying in the bush. Because on October 24, 1978, Kirsten and her boyfriend Stan, while exercising their greyhounds, found the first of the Spear Creek victims. You'll hear that Kirsten has a bit of an accent and she's talking to me over the phone, so bear with her.
No, we had to drive to a secluded place in the bush. I went up and walked the dogs up. On the riverbed, I seen that body lying there.
So Kirsten explains that the local council had brought a grader in and levelled out a track in the bush behind the airport runway. They'd done that because they'd wanted greyhound trainers to use it as a place to exercise their dogs, away from the town and away from other dogs. And this is where she and Stan had taken their greyhounds. Kirsten had gone up ahead, and when the dogs had veered off into the tree line, she'd gone in after them. That took her to the top of the banks of the then dry Spear Creek, and that's where he'd been.
Yeah, it was the full body of a male. Wouldn't expect to see something like that, and it was out of town, it was bush.
She says it was very, very hot and very, very dry. She ran back to Stan and they rounded the dogs up, put them in the car and went back to look. She didn't want to get too close. They stood at the top of the creek bank, not wanting to disturb a potential crime scene. Then they drove back into town to find help. They passed a police car driving over the bridge coming into town and they waved it down. The police followed them home where Kirsten took the dogs inside and Stan returned to the bush with the police. So let's rewind a little, because something very important happens on this trip of a lifetime that Karen, Tim and Gordon take. Somewhere along the road, they are joined by a 4th person. And we know this because in the days after their bodies were discovered, police asked the public for help. They wanted to hear from anyone who had seen the group on their travels. And people came forward, because who wouldn't remember 2 motorbikes, including one with a distinctive homemade sidecar that had a Doberman puppy sitting on top. Tim's bike was especially memorable to anyone who had an interest in motorbikes. The 1977 BMW R100S, with its South Australian plates, was a nice bike, and not something you saw on outback roads every day. Now, at first people remember seeing the 3 of them, and of course the puppy Tristy, but then a 3rd bike joins them. And people very distinctly remember a 3rd man. The 4 of them were seen talking as though they were all friends. So here is how their journey unfolded. On September 30, Karen's flight lands in Alice Springs. She joins up with Tim and Gordon, and they spend a few days preparing for what was supposed to be a nearly 3-month journey. They set off from Alice on October 2. All their gear, including tents and clothing and supplies, is packed into Tim's sidecar, the one with the map of Australia painted on its side. They head north, stopping at a roadhouse about an hour away, before travelling another hour to Tea Tree. They set up camp and they stay the night. The next morning, they get up and continue north. They stop in at a few places, but one of them is Kalu Kalu, or Devil's Marbles, about 4.5 hours north of Alice Springs. The collection of massive granite boulders is a major tourist attraction and an important place in Aboriginal culture. Suzanne Rigby was among the tourists on the day Karen, Tim and Gordon come through. She was part of a group of 4 people, 2 couples who were also on touring bikes, and she remembers spending nearly an hour talking to Karen in particular.
They were really, really nice people. They were happy. They were leaving Alice Springs, going to Mount Isa. I think one of them mentioned they might have some work there, but they were going to go over to Mount Isa, back onto the coast, Queensland coast, and I think back down to Victoria. I think the girl's name was Karen, was it?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Karen, yeah. She was looking forward to going home. I know she was studying for something too. We must have spoken for about an hour, I suppose, and the reason we pulled over is we were heading to Alice Springs and from Mount Isa, and they were heading from Mount Isa to Alice, and we stopped at Devil's Marbles.
I think what she meant to say here was Karen, Tim and Gordon were heading from Alice Springs to Mount Isa.
Because we wanted to see these great big rocks and that. But what got to me was I had to take some photos, was that they had a dog with them, but they had a sidecar, little homemade type sidecar, and the black Kelpie type dog sat there. That was his spot. And it was just a real crack up, Yeah. It was a real family affair, it was. When I heard about it, we were living in a caravan park. We had a caravan there, and I just got home from work and had the radio on, and the news came on, and they said that they'd just discovered 3 people had been murdered at Mount Isa, and I don't know why, but I knew it was them straight away. I was devastated, and I don't know why, but I just knew it was them. And I waited for my partner to come home about half an hour later, and we went straight to the police. It's one thing that's always stuck in my mind, It could have been us, or someone else. But it's just so damn tragic because they had their whole lives ahead of them. And like I said, and I'd like their parents to know that the day that we saw them, they were very happy. They were laughing and were having a joke and mucking around, and, it was a really pleasant hour or so with them. It was a beautiful day.
Byron Boxall was another in that group of 4. He remembers Karen, Tim and Gordon too. And that's because, he says, if you were in a group touring the outback on motorbikes and you saw another group doing the same thing, of course you'd stop to chat.
We were on motorbikes too, you see, and they were on motorbikes, and when you're out in the whoop-whoop, you tend to sort of, if you see motorbikes, you tend to stop and have a chat. There was a lot of people travelling around on motorbikes then. It was such a great way to travel back then. We chat to them for a while, just talk to them about where they'd been working and what they'd done in, they did stand out because they had the dog sitting up on the sidecar, and it was a sort of a homemade sort of, wasn't a factory bought sidecar. There was a specially made one. Yeah, it was pretty. So yeah, but I mean, hey, we'd have stopped anyway whether they had the dog in the sidecar or not. We'd have stopped there anyway and chatted to them. It was more or less a month later. It was on the news in Alice Springs, asking if anyone that had come into contact with these people and showed a picture of them, would they contact the Mount Isa police, the local police. So we seen on the news. So straight away the next day, we just went down to the police station at Alice Springs and told them what had gone on. And they contacted the police from Mount Isa, and the detectives come over twice to us from Mount Isa. We just thought it could have been us. The perpetrator or perpetrators could be dead now. But then again, they could be sitting out there bloody thinking they got away with it. And they have got away with it for 40 years, you know what I mean? These people have been dead for 40 years now. Their families have never had any proper closure of what happened to them or anything, you know what I mean?
From Devil's Marbles, they travel north again to the 3-way service station. Another traveller, Paul Clisby, remembers them there.
I just remember there was a couple of motorbikes, one with a sidecar. There was a couple, and they were just a reasonably friendly sort of couple. There was a single guy that was riding the other bike. He was sitting off to one side, didn't really want to know anything about anything. We helped them change a tyre that had blown. on the bike. I think it was the bike with the sidecar. I honestly can't remember. I didn't actually do too much work on it. The other guy that I was with was the more of the mechanical side. We'd actually just spent a weekend, or I think it was an Easter break or a long weekend or something up in Darwin.
Okay.
And we were heading back to Tennant Creek, where we were living at the time. We just dropped off for a drink and something to eat. The Shell service station, absolutely in the middle of nowhere. Next door is it was just a 24-hour bar, but it's basically a three-way intersection where the Stewart Highway heads off to up and down the Territory and then across to Isa, so hence three ways. I had a map of Australia on the top of the, I think from memory it was a bit of a home-built sidecar, but obviously just cruising around. I can't remember the conversation, but that would have been the conversation about where they're going, how they're going, where they'd been. There was a report about on the news. We used to get our TV news out of Brisbane talking about this murder that had taken place, and there was a call out that if anybody had seen anything to get in touch with the police and come forward. And then I would assume they would have flashed something up on the screen to say, these are the sort of things that the people that we're trying to get information about. Obviously, back in those days, there wouldn't have been any CCTV anywhere, so I believe the police were trying to recall where they had been and gone, trying to retrace their steps, etc. Yeah. I know I went forward. The others must have come forward as well, because the police were looking for them to track them down with the story as well.
From the three ways, the group took a right-hand turn onto the Barkly Highway. Their next stop was the Frewena Roadhouse. The Roadhouse is another of those places absolutely in the middle of nowhere. Harry Griffiths was the manager at the time. He'd taken over the business from his parents, who'd bought it in the late 60s. I asked him what it was like out there. Was it just a rest stop on a lonely stretch of highway?
Out in the bush, the only people that lived there was the people that worked at the Roadhouse. 8 or 9 there at times, working there with staff, because we used to feed the Pioneer and the Greyhound bus every night. All the truck drivers, all the Malanda milk truck drivers that used to go through to Darwin with the Malanda milk, Bundine Roadways, which was a big cattle carting company in there. His trucks used to pull in there and fuel up and out the back of the Roadhouse. There used to be a 500 square mile Lincoln paddock that was a government quarantined it, and the cattle used to have to be unloaded there and taken for a 3-day dip before they could go into Queensland, where it was tick-free. So you'd have all the drivers at the Roadhouse there for 3 days while they were waiting to reload again.
Harry too remembers seeing the three friends and the puppy, but there's something different about his recollections, something important, because Harry recalls seeing a fourth person travelling with the group, and whoever this fourth person was, they've never come forward.
A motorbike pulled in, a BMW with a sidecar on it, which was very unusual for up in that country. And there was a bloke and a Sheila and a little dog in it. They filled up with fuel and pulled out of the way of the Bowser, and the girl went and got the dog a drink of water, and they come into the Roadhouse and had some drinks, and then within a couple of minutes another bike pulled in and it filled up and moved over to out of the way of the Bowser, and then a third bike come in and it did the same. And they were all in the bar, and they had drinks together, and they played pool together, and then they left together. One was a tall bloke, the other two blokes were probably medium, and the girl was a little sort of a girl. The blokes had a couple of drinks, the girl only had one squash, and she was more looking after the little dog they had. Not long after it was discovered in Mount Isa, or just out of Mount Isa, Tennant Creek Sergeant, Dick Stanley, he was there to interview me to see if I'd seen him come through. On motorbikes, that's the only way you could take it. You had to come up to the three ways just north of Tennant Creek and come across on the bitumen. And the motorbikes that they had were not sort of motorbikes that we saw in that country very often. It was very unusual to see the Japanese bikes with the racing cowlings on them.
Harry Griffiths was not the only person to have seen this fourth member of the group. After playing pool and having a few drinks at Farwena, they got back on their bikes and continued along the Barkly Highway. Their next stop, Barry Caves, was where they are believed to have camped for the night. Then, the following morning, they packed up and headed into Mount Isa. This is where more people spotted the now group of 4. Among them was a woman I spoke to. She didn't want me to use her name or her voice, but she has very clear memories of seeing the group outside the local pub. She was only young at the time, maybe early teens, and she had come into town with her mother and her uncle. She remembers it being Child Endowment Day, and her mother needed to visit the post office. I'm going to call her Beth, but that's not her real name. Beth says she was standing in the street in the sun because it was a cold morning, and she remembers 3 motorbikes pulling in front of the hotel. And Beth's story is interesting because she is not one of the people originally tracked down by police. Beth came forward just a few months ago after she spotted something online about the Spear Creek murders. I think it might have been an article in the Northwest Star published back in November for the 40th anniversary of the murders. That's a local paper. She saw the story about the 3 travellers and thought, hang on, that's wrong. There were 4 people in that group, not 3, so she called police. She tells me her mum had bought her hot chips or maybe a packet of chips. And she tells me outside the hotel there had once been a long concrete seat, so she'd sat down to eat her chips in the sun. When the 3 bikes pulled in, a woman and 2 of the men got off and approached her uncle. They asked, what time does the pub open? The 3rd man stayed with the bikes, but there was something odd about the way he stood there, she says, leaning against his bike possessively, as though he was waiting for someone to try and steal it. Beth says her uncle spoke with the 3 travellers briefly and they went inside the hotel, leaving the man outside with the bikes. She hadn't looked at them much. She says back then your parents would tell you it was rude to stare at strangers. But she did look at the man who'd remained outside. She says he was well dressed, well groomed. He was wearing nice boots and clothing, not like the usual Mount Isa motorbike rider. She stresses to me that he didn't look like a classic long-haired bikie from back in the 70s. He was too neat, short hair, maybe a moustache, like he was from a good family with money. And then, soon after, they left. She says they didn't drive straight, as she'd expected. Instead, they left the Isa Hotel and turned left. And that left-hand turn from the Isa Hotel takes you straight to the Moondarra Caravan Park, where Karen, Tim and Gordon were booked to stay 2 nights. So let's go now to the evening of October 5, 1978. This is the day the 3 friends were seen getting into the light-coloured Toyota Land Cruiser that morning. And then the Land Cruiser returns on dark. A man gets out and packs up their campsite, throwing tents and camping gear into his car. Christopher Byrne was living at the Lake Moondarra Caravan Park in October 1978.
I was basically just doing a bit of a tour around Australia and just happened to be in Mount Isa, basically. I happened to go for a job interview and got a job. I wasn't actually working in the mine. I was living in the caravan park. There was I had a motorbike and a tent, and I would just leave the few positions I had in my tent and just scuttle off to work each day, and then girl and the guy were about my age, the sort of younger ones. Didn't have a huge amount to do with them, but they were serious motorbike touring people who seemed to, and they had some more expensive motorbikes. When they were there on one particular occasion, they had actually taken their sidecar / trailer off and left it, and it appeared for all intents and purposes that they had moved on and left some of their gear behind. We're sitting around, there was a friend and I who we, during the evening we'd sort of just sit around, have a couple of beers and have a campfire and maybe cook a meal or something. And so one night we were doing this, and this is maybe a few nights after the sidecar had been left there. And a car pulled up, and it was during the evening time, just sort of early evening but dark. You tend to be a little bit blinded by the sort of light from the fire. So I'm sitting there and sort of look over, and see a van, throwing all the stuff into their car. But it was all a bit sort of, I could sort of see them, but I couldn't see them. They might have been a few words spoken or something, and they collect all the gear up and then sort of just drove off.
Was it just one person or more than one person?
It seemed to be one person.
Okay.
I'd definitely say one person.
So police believe this was the night of the 5th, the day Karen Edwards, Timothy Thompson and Gordon Twaddle were last seen alive. On October 2, Karen, Tim and Gordon leave Alice Springs, just the three of them. They travel north, stopping at a couple of places before camping at Tea Tree. The next day they make a few more stops. They have their picture taken at Devil's Marbles. They change a tyre at the Three Ways. By the time they stop for a beer and a game of pool at the Fruina Roadhouse, there are 4 of them. They've been joined by a mystery bike rider. And according to witnesses, the man on the bike is still with them when they arrive in Mount Isa. And he heads off with them towards the caravan park where the 3 friends were booked to stay for 2 nights. On the morning of October 5, a man arrives at the park in a Toyota Land Cruiser and they all pile in. Tim's Doberman puppy Tristy is left tied up. Tim loved his dog, so it's unlikely he planned on leaving her there long. But then they never come back. If you remember seeing the group during their travels, or if you know anything at all about the murders, it's time to contact police. You can call Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000. Next week on Spear Creek, we hear about the investigation from the police who were there at the time, including the harrowing story of the helicopter crash which forced some of the initial investigators off the job. Spear Creek is written by Kate Kiriakou and produced by Sean Callanan for the Courier Mail.